What made it such a shock when he told me what happened? Basically, Brad's father caught Brad and Patrick together. I guess that Brad's father didn't know about his son, because when he caught them, Brad's father started beating Brad. Not a slap kind of beating, a belt kind, a real kind. Patrick told Sam, who told Bob, that he'd never seen anything like it. I guess it was that bad. He wanted to say stop, and you're killing him. He even wanted to hold Brad's father down, but he just froze, and Brad kept yelling, "Get out!" And finally, Patrick just did. Really intense start to part 4 of The Perks of Being a Wallflower. What's up? If you've never been to the channel before, I'm Mr. Jordan. I talk about books and analyze them and do close readings of them and hopefully help you out or just help you enjoy them. Today we're talking about part 4 from The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky, and the whole section kind of kicks off with this really intense, violent bit of retribution. And throughout the book, there's this constant cycle of how the things that have come before us sort of tie us down, or they chain us to a certain kind of identity, right? All of the characters are stuck in the sort of same tracks, or the same line as their parents and their grandparents and the people that came before them. And this is how culture is formed, and it's how culture informs our identity and who we are. But the main character, Charlie, is constantly struggling with this, right? Because he doesn't identify that closely with his parents, with his brother, with his sister, with the other kids at school. And he wants to know who he is, and to find that out, he has to face up to all of these conflicts. Much as we all do as book lovers, Charlie's favorite teacher, Bill, constantly gives Charlie books. And the idea is that he's looking for some greater meaning or purpose in these books. His teacher is trying to speak to Charlie and communicate to him through these other words and the words of the authors and characters. And Charlie likewise is trying to glean some greater meaning or deeper purpose in life from his reading, much as I do, and I'm sure you do as well when you read a book. And there's this quote in here from a book which we ought to be all skeptical about, and Charlie's teacher tells him to read with a filter. It's a book called The Fountainhead. But there's a key quote in section 4 from that book. It says, "I would die for you, but I won't live for you." Something like that. I think that the idea is that every person has to live for his or her own life and then make the choice to share it with other people. Maybe that is what makes people participate. And so this is getting this idea that Charlie can't fully go in, right? He's always held back. He's always an outsider. He's the perennial wallflower, the one who's watching, who's standing by, who's refusing to get his hands dirty or sort of stick his nose into it. And that's a kind of endless story, right? That is the struggle of so many famous protagonists. It's Hamlet trying to decide whether he should avenge his father's death. It's the struggle of basically every 20th century novel after World War II. Should the character participate or not participate? Is it even worth it? What do I do? Why do I live? What's the point? It's literally the question of the human condition, the purpose of existence. It's also the question of a lot of the novels that Charlie is given by his teacher. The Great Gatsby, Catcher in the Rye. A lot of these books are sort of questioning the purposes and the drives and force behind 20th century America and what it means to grow up and to live in this place. And that's ultimately the same identity that Charlie is struggling with comprehending. There's also this idea of reckonings, right? The book is coming to an end, it's closing, and everyone has to face their own identity. And chronologically, this comes at the end of the school year, which it does for teachers, for students, for everyone, right? When June comes around, we know that it's over. Something has ended. There'll be a reboot, and then something new will begin. In Sam's case, she's going off to college and leaving Charlie behind. In Charlie's case, he's going to start a new year at high school without these friends that he's made, right? Without his sister, who's also leaving. And as Brad and Patrick have this big, violent explosion, the sister kind of starts to shun Charlie and say she doesn't want him around anymore. And then Sam breaks up with her boyfriend, and Sam also kind of asks Charlie why he never did anything, why he didn't try to make a move on her. And it's this moment sort of where Charlie has to understand that he's allowed to make the choice, whether it's the wrong choice or the right choice, right? So he makes a terrible choice to say that Sam's the prettiest girl in the room when he's in front of Mary Elizabeth and when Sam's boyfriend is there. But there were other opportunities, right? There were other times when he could have gone out and fought or struggled or reached out to just choose something. And he didn't. He chose to hold back, to not participate, to be indecisive. I think that's what this quote, the famous quote, the one from the movie where they're driving through the tunnel and they see the city and the lights. I think that's kind of what that's about, right? To interpret that quote, it's about someone coming through a transition, right? You go through the tunnel, you enter on one side, you come out the other. You start grade 9 as an innocent, naive, surprised, stunned person. You come out of the other side as this experienced sophomore, as a grade 10 who knows the lay of the land at school. And that's what Charlie is struggling with, right? Is he going to be able to do that? Can he leave his childhood behind and become a teenager, an adolescent, and eventually an adult, functioning properly, being human? It's this quote. You see the opening right in front of you, and the radio comes back even louder than you remember it, and the wind is waiting. And you fly out of the tunnel onto the bridge, and there it is, the city. A million lights and buildings, and everything seems as exciting as the first time you saw it. It really is a grand entrance. Again, this idea of being on a precipice, right? The whole thing, the city, the downtown, the lights, it's like New York, or going to LA, or go to London. It's this idea of embracing life, of diving in, of going head first, of making the choice to commit. The leap of faith, as some might say. This idea too that Charlie had a choice and could have participated more actively and maybe changed the course of his own life, right? Rather than be this passive aggressive bystander, this wallflower, Charlie could have actually been an active decider or controller of his own fate, is explicitly voiced and told to us by Sam. She eventually sort of reveals this truth to Charlie before she leaves for college. She says to him, Charlie, don't you get it? I can't feel that. It's sweet and everything, but it's like you're not even here sometimes. Again, right, this idea that Charlie's like a ghost or an apparition, like he's just literally the wallflower. He's a butterfly. You can't touch him. He's not real. He's insubstantial. It's great that you can listen and be a shoulder to someone, but what about when someone doesn't need a shoulder? What if they need the arms or something like that? You can't just sit there and put everybody's lives ahead of yours and think that counts as love. You just can't. You have to do things. This is a kind of sly reference to what Charlie does, which is he gives everyone gifts constantly. He has this obsession with giving gifts and things and presents, right? He tries to imbue all of his love, his emotion, his feeling into a physical thing. Here is the book. Here's the mixtape. Here's the present from me to you. But he doesn't give himself, right? Charlie doesn't allow himself to be vulnerable. And that's ultimately what connecting, what sympathizing, empathizing, being human and having a relationship is about. You have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. You have to be present with the other person. And Charlie doesn't do that for Sam, right? Unfortunately, but truly. You can't just sit there and put everybody's lives ahead of yours and think that counts as love. You just can't. You have to do things. Like what? Says Charlie. My mouth was dry. I don't know. Take their hands when the slow song comes up for a change. Or be the one who asks someone for a date. Or tell people what you need. What you want. Like on the dance floor. Did you want to kiss me? Yeah, I said. Really strong moment between Sam and Charlie, right? just like Brad and Patrick and the father having this like violent confrontation, this is a confrontation where Sam no longer allows Charlie to slip by passively. She knows what he wants. He knows what he wants. But he hasn't acted on it. He hasn't done anything about it. And because of that, nothing has changed in their relationship. And then, of course, the inevitable happens, which is that Charlie finally has the huge falling apart and the breakdown that there was so much lead up to in part 3. If you didn't watch the video I made about part 3, analyzing that section, I will link it above my left my left shoulder. I'll put a link up there to a card, and you can check out that other video. So finally, he has this kind of moment of breakdown, and it happens on a couch with Sam, and then it brings up this memory. It resurfaces this memory of trauma and an inappropriate past relationship that he's had with his aunt, and has been foreshadowed and sort of referenced or alluded to frequently throughout the text, but never actually bubbled up and brought to the surface. I started to cry really hard. Here, just lie down on the couch, she said. She laid me down on the couch. She brought out a damp washcloth and put it on my forehead. You can sleep here tonight, okay? Okay. Just calm down. Take deep breaths. I did what you told me. And just before I fell asleep, I said something. I can't do that anymore, I said. I'm sorry. It's okay, Charlie. Just go to sleep, Sam said. But I wasn't talking to Sam anymore. I was talking to someone else. And who he's talking to is the memory of his Aunt Helen. And this trauma of his Aunt Helen abusing him and touching him and doing inappropriate things with him when they were home alone on weekends and he was on the couch resurfaces. It's been brought up to the fore by the sort of cracking up or falling apart which he's had at the end of the school year, and which is kind of like been exaggerated and made worse by the fact that he's smoking too much weed and he's drinking and he's not actually participating in the friendship that his friends are inviting him to be a part of. He's remaining separate and an outsider, and he's not committing. And this is how it finally breaks down. And we find out in the epilogue, just like Holden in The Catcher in the Rye, that he's been hospitalized again, and he's actually had a sort of crack up or a breakup, a nervous breakdown. And all of that past trauma and truth has finally been released, and his parents have found out, and he no longer has to bear the burden of that secret. So if any of you are dealing with that kind of secret, I highly recommend figuring out a way to get it off your shoulders, get it out of your chest, let go of it. Don't let the past haunt you. Dear friend, I've been in the hospital for the past 2 months. They just released me yesterday. The doctor told me that my mother and father found me sitting on the couch in the family room. I was completely naked. Again, here's this idea, right? It's this idea and this illusion that the couch in the family room is where he was abused by his Aunt Helen. So he's been reliving this circle, this idea of the vicious circle and of the violence and the trauma repeating itself if Charlie can't break that circle, right? If he can't act to make change, to change his life for the better, he'll be constantly stuck in repeating the errors of the past. And eventually he tells us this. It's kind of a long quote, but I'm going to read you the whole thing because I think it's important. And it really sort of summarizes and sums up the whole sort of thesis or the main thrust and argument or through line that knits and stitches this whole story and plot together. Quote, it's like if I blamed my Aunt Helen. I would have to blame her dad for hitting her and the friend of the family that fooled around with her when she was little and the person that fooled around with him and God for not stopping all this and things that are much worse. So he's painting this picture of a circle, right? Of one event being connected to the other. It's a loop. And Charlie's gonna have to break that loop to move on. And I did that for a while, but then I just couldn't anymore. Because it wasn't going anywhere. Because it wasn't the point. I'm not the way I am because of what I dreamt and remembered about my Aunt Helen. That's what I figured out when things got quiet. And I think that it's very important to know. I made things feel clear and together. Don't get me wrong. I know what happened was important, and I needed to remember it. But it's like when my doctor told me the story of these two brothers whose dad was a bad alcoholic. One brother grew up to be a successful carpenter who never drank. Carpenter, like Jesus. The other brother ended up being a drinker as bad as his dad was. When they asked the first brother why he didn't drink, he said that after he saw what it did to his father, he could never bring himself to even try it. When they asked the older brother, he said that he guessed he learned how to drink on his father's knee. So I guess we are who we are for a lot of reasons. Well, who we are, that's your identity, right? We are who we are. I am who I am. That's what makes up your identity. It's what defines you. And maybe we'll never know most of them, the reasons that make up our identity. But even if we don't have the power to choose where we come from, we can still choose where we go from there. We can still do things, and we can try to feel okay about them. And that's what Charlie's been searching for this whole book. We can go places, go to the city, the place with opportunity, the bright lights. Look to Eastern mysticism and Zen and the infinite feeling of beauty when you're content. That's what Charlie's been reaching for. And this is the thesis of the book. This is the whole main idea about coming to terms with trauma and reconciling yourself with life and moving on and participating by living in the now and in the present. It's a beautiful book and a beautiful image, and I think I should just leave it there. So thanks so much for watching. Take care. Like and sub if you want. I'm Mr. Jordan. Adios.